Lyra had always known she didn't belong. From the moment she took her first breath on the glittering world of Galdar Prime, the center of the Galdorian Empire, she was an outsider. She was smaller than the other children, her limbs fragile compared to the towering figures around her, and her mind felt sluggish next to the sharp telepathic abilities of her peers. Her hair, unlike the iridescent silver that was common among Galdorians, was a deep chestnut brown, inherited from her human father. Every aspect of her screamed difference. Her earliest memories were filled with the laughter of the Galdorian children, but not the kind that echoed joy. It was the cold, mocking kind, always directed at her. They pointed at her short, soft hair, her large, expressive eyes, and her inability to grasp their telepathic games. She couldn't sense thoughts or send messages through the invisible current that connected their minds. No matter how hard she tried, that world remained locked to her. "The little earthling can't even lift a thought," one boy sneered, his voice amplified by his telepathic projection, making it impossible for Lyra to block out his words. "She doesn't belong here. She's weak." "Why do they even keep her in the city?" another girl chimed in, her nose wrinkled in disgust as she stared at Lyra with her shimmering violet eyes. Lyra had learned to ignore them. She'd bite her lip, holding back the tears, and walk away as if their words didn't pierce her heart. Every insult was like a crack in the dam of her resolve, but she never let it break. If she did, she feared they would see the flood of emotion she kept hidden, and that would be worse than their laughter. Emotions were a sign of weakness to the Galdorians, something humans were often ridiculed for. Her mother, Lyrian, was a brilliant scientist who had once been respected among the Galdorians. She had pioneered the study of xenobiology, and it was her research that had brought her to Earth, where she had met Lyra's father, Captain Jonathan Reyes. He was an explorer, full of stories of distant stars and forgotten worlds. Their love had been intense, passionate, and forbidden. The Galdorian Council had strict laws about relationships with lesser species. Earth, with its lack of advanced technology and psychokinetic abilities, was considered primitive. But Lyrian had defied those laws, and when she returned to Galdar Prime with a half-human child, the Council had stripped her of her status and branded her a traitor to the Empire. Lyra's father had died shortly after they arrived on Galdar Prime, in a ship accident she barely remembered. And then, one day, her mother vanished. No one would tell her what happened, whether her mother had left voluntarily or if the Council had taken her away. Lyra had been left alone, under the care of a distant relative who treated her with cold indifference. Her only comfort was the stars. On the edge of the city, beyond the crystalline towers that glowed with an ethereal light, Lyra would escape to the cliffs overlooking the Void Ridge. There, she could sit for hours, gazing out into the vast sea of stars, wondering if her mother was out there somewhere, or if the answers to her heritage lay hidden in the distant galaxies. "Why was I born so different?" she would ask herself, the question echoing in her mind, unanswered. One night, as Lyra sat in her usual spot on the cliffs, the sky above her seemed more alive than usual. The stars pulsed with a strange rhythm, their light flickering like the beat of a giant heart. The vastness of space stretched before her, and for a moment she felt something deep inside herself stir, as though the universe itself was whispering to her. A sudden voice, soft yet commanding, echoed in her mind, "You are not weak. You are more than they know. You are the link between two ancient worlds." Lyra jumped to her feet, heart pounding. She looked around, but there was no one nearby. The voice wasn't Galdorian, it didn't have the usual smooth cadence of their telepathy. This was something else, something foreign yet familiar, like a distant memory from a past she had never lived. "Who's there?" she thought, trying to project her question into the ether, though she had never been able to communicate telepathically before. But the voice didn't answer. Instead, it faded away, leaving behind a strange warmth in her chest, a sensation that felt both comforting and unsettling. It was as if a door had been opened, just a crack, allowing a glimpse of something vast and ancient beyond her understanding. The next day, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The mocking of the other children continued as usual, but this time, it didn't sting as much. She felt an odd sense of detachment, as if their words couldn't reach the part of her that mattered. During her lessons in the academy, while the others practiced their telepathy, Lyra focused inward, trying to understand the strange sensation that had awakened within her. She couldn't explain it, but it felt like a seed had been planted deep within her, and now it was slowly beginning to grow. Days turned into weeks, and though she kept the experience to herself, the whispers in her mind grew stronger. They came at random moments when she was alone, or when she was most frustrated by her inability to connect with the Galdorian telepathic current. The voice told her of an ancient bond between humans and Galdorians, a time when their strengths had complemented each other, before pride and arrogance had driven them apart. She tried to ignore it, afraid of what it might mean. But one night, as she lay in her small room in the academy, the voice returned, more insistent this time. You are not just human, nor just Galdorian. You are both. And in that, there is power. Listen to the stars, Lyra. Your ancestors are calling you. She bolted upright, heart racing. The sensation inside her flared again, like a spark catching fire. She closed her eyes and concentrated, reaching for the source of that warmth. For the first time, she felt something faint, but unmistakably real. It was a connection, like a tiny thread reaching out into the vast web of the Galdorian telepathic current. She could feel it, just barely a distant hum of thought and energy. It wasn't strong enough for her to communicate, but it was there, like a hidden melody only she could hear. Lyra's eyes flew open, breathless. Had she just tapped into the current? No matter how faintly, it was more than she had ever managed before. But when she tried to share her discovery, no one believed her. Her teachers dismissed it as wishful thinking, and the students ridiculed her more than ever. The little earthling thinks she can use the telepathic current now, one boy snickered during training. As if her puny mind could handle it. But this time, Lyra didn't walk away in shame. She stood her ground, her heart steady as the whispers in her mind grew louder, filling her with a sense of purpose she had never known before. She might not fully understand what was happening to her, but she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer alone. Something within her had awoken, and it was only a matter of time before the others would see it too. The little earthling was about to become something far more than they could ever imagine. Lyra wandered the streets of Galdar Prime with a new sense of awareness, yet no one around her noticed the shift. The towering crystalline spires of the Galdorian capital shimmered with their usual cold beauty, casting long shadows over the alien city. Lyra had walked these streets her entire life, but they felt different now. Every corner, every alleyway seemed to hum with energy, like a distant memory hovering just out of reach. She couldn't stop thinking about the voice, the strange, ancient presence that had stirred inside her that night by the cliffs. The words echoed in her mind, "You are not just human, nor just Galdorian. You are both. And in that, there is power." What did it mean? What power could she possibly have, when she had spent her entire life being ridiculed for her weakness? She tried to push the thoughts away, but they returned, stronger each time. The Galdorian Academy had never been a place of comfort for her, but now, it felt suffocating. Her teachers still viewed her as an anomaly, a child of two incompatible worlds, while the students remained relentless in their mockery. But now, Lyra found herself standing on the edge of something unknown, something both thrilling and terrifying. It wasn't long before her teachers noticed her distraction. During a lesson on Galdorian telekinetic techniques, the instructor, Master Raylon, singled her out. "Lyra," he said sharply, his violet eyes narrowing as he surveyed her from the front of the class. "Focus. Your mind is wandering again." The other students snickered, their telepathic whispers filling the room like a cold breeze. They loved to see her fail, and Lyra could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on her. "I'm trying," she muttered, her hands clenched into fists. "Trying isn't enough," Raylon said, his voice clipped. You must be the current, not merely touch it. Or perhaps, he added with a disdainful glance, it is simply beyond you, as we have always suspected. The room fell silent, and Lyra felt a familiar flush of humiliation creeping up her neck. Her pulse quickened, but this time, something different stirred beneath the surface of her emotions. The warmth in her chest, the strange connection she had felt flared again, and for a moment, she could hear a faint whisper, almost like a melody weaving through her thoughts. Without thinking, Lyra closed her eyes and reached inward, focusing on that elusive hum she had sensed before. It was distant, like the faintest glimmer of light in the vastness of space, but it was there, waiting. You are the link, the voice whispered again, clearer this time. Reach for what is yours. The classroom fell away, and Lyra was no longer standing before Master Raylon or her mocking classmates. In her mind, she saw the stars, the endless expanse of the universe, stretching out in every direction. She felt something ancient stirring deep within her, something that connected her to both human and Galdorian ancestry, and perhaps even beyond. Suddenly, the air around her crackled with energy. The faint hum she had sensed before was now a powerful current, and Lyra could feel it flowing through her, connecting her to the vast telepathic web that spanned the Galdorian city. For the first time, it didn't feel distant or unreachable. It felt like hers. She gasped as the sensation surged through her, her mind expanding as if a door had been thrown open, revealing an entire world she had never known existed. Thoughts, emotions, and memories not just her own, but those of the ancient Galdorian ancestors rushed through her in a whirlwind of light and sound. When she opened her eyes, the room was silent. Her classmates stared at her in shock. Master Raylon had taken a step back, his eyes wide with disbelief. The energy surrounding her slowly dissipated, leaving behind an eerie calm. Lyra blinked, feeling disoriented. Had that really just happened? Had she connected to the telepathic current? Raylon recovered quickly, his expression hardening. What was that? He demanded, his voice sharp and accusatory. What did you just do? I don't know, Lyra stammered, the words catching in her throat. She felt the eyes of the entire class on her, their telepathic whispers swirling around her like a storm. But this time, she wasn't afraid of them. Something had changed, and they knew it too. Raylon stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as if trying to read her mind, but he couldn't. Lyra could feel his frustration mounting. Whatever that was, it was not Galdorian telepathy, he said, his voice laced with disdain. It was something other. Lyra didn't respond. She didn't have the words to explain what she had just experienced. All she knew was that for the first time in her life, she had felt a connection, something real, something powerful, and it had come from deep within her. That night, Lyra returned to the cliffs at the edge of the city. The stars above twinkled like diamonds scattered across the dark sky, and once again, she felt that strange pull, as if the universe itself was trying to speak to her. She closed her eyes and let the whispers fill her mind. They were louder now, clearer, like voices from another time, another place. They spoke of ancient bonds between humans and Galdorians, a time when the two species had lived not in conflict, but in harmony. The voice from before returned, stronger and more distinct. You carry the blood of two worlds, it said, resonating through her entire being. But your power comes from something older, something forgotten. Lyra's heart raced. She felt the weight of those words settle on her like a cloak. Could it be true? Could she really be connected to something more than just her human and Galdorian heritage? The voice continued, softer now, but no less commanding. Your ancestors are calling you. Their strength lies within you, waiting to be awakened. But you must seek it, Lyra. You must go where no one else dares. A chill ran down her spine, but not from fear. It was a challenge, a call to action. The stars seemed to pulse in response, their light growing brighter as the voice faded into the night. Lyra opened her eyes and gazed out into the vastness of space. She knew then that the answers she sought weren't going to be found in the Academy or in the city of Galdar Prime. Her path lay somewhere far beyond, in the forgotten places of the universe. For the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. There was more to her than the frail, weak girl the others saw. There was something ancient and powerful inside her, something that had been waiting to be awakened for centuries. But she would have to find it on her own. The next day, Lyra made her way to the archives, the oldest part of the Galdorian city. It was a vast, sprawling library filled with records dating back millennia, most of them forgotten by the modern Galdorians who preferred to focus on their technological advancements. Lyra had never been allowed inside before, but now, with the whispers still fresh in her mind, she knew she had to find answers. The archivist, an elderly Galdorian woman with pale silver hair, looked up as Lyra entered. Her eyes narrowed in suspicion, but she said nothing, simply gesturing for Lyra to proceed. Lyra moved through the towering shelves, scanning the dusty records for anything that might explain the strange connection she felt. For hours, she searched, poring over ancient texts and forgotten histories. And then, in the darkest corner of the archives, she found it, a faded record of the Shaldra Anu, the Forgotten Bond. According to the text, humans and Galdorians had once shared a deeper connection, long before the rise of the Galdorian Empire. It spoke of a time when their minds and spirits were intertwined, when their strengths complemented each other. But that bond had been broken, severed by war and pride. The record ended with a cryptic message: only through the trials of the forgotten will the bond be restored. Lyra's pulse quickened. The trials? What were they? And where could she find them? She closed the book and stood, a sense of determination settling over her. The answers were out there, waiting for her. She was no longer just the little earthling. The path ahead was uncertain, but Lyra knew one thing: she was no longer afraid. The whispers of her ancestors would guide her, and she would find the strength that had been hidden within her all along. The journey to awaken that power had begun. The first trial began the moment Lyra crossed the threshold. The world around her shifted, and she found herself standing in a dark, cavernous space, illuminated only by faint, glowing runes etched into the walls. The air was cold, and her breath came in short, ragged gasps. Before her stood a tall, shadowy figure, its face obscured, but its presence unmistakable. It radiated power, and Lyra felt a wave of fear wash over her. This was no ordinary opponent. This was the first of the trials, the test of resilience. The figure moved toward her without a sound, and as it did, Lyra's surroundings shifted again. Suddenly, she was no longer in the cavern. She was back in the academy, standing before her classmates as they mocked her. Their voices filled her ears, cruel and cutting, reminding her of every failure, every moment of weakness. Look at her. She's nothing but a pathetic human. She'll never be one of us. She doesn't belong. The words stung, just as they always had, but this time, Lyra refused to let them break her. She closed her eyes and focused on the warmth within her chest, the strange connection she had felt since the voice first spoke to her. The insults were nothing but illusions, echoes of the past. They couldn't hurt her anymore. When she opened her eyes, the scene had changed again. Now she stood on the cliff's edge, staring out into the endless void where her father's ship had disappeared. She could hear the faint echoes of his voice calling to her, begging her to save him. It was a memory she had long buried, but here, it resurfaced with brutal clarity. Her chest tightened, and for a moment, the grief threatened to overwhelm her. But then, the voice of her ancestors returned, stronger this time. You are not your past, Lyra. You are more than your pain. You must let it go. Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded, refusing to let the past chain her any longer. The grief, the loss, the loneliness, they were a part of her, but they did not define her. She had endured, she had survived, and now she would rise. With that realization, the shadowy figure vanished, and the cavern reappeared around her. She had passed the first trial. Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that her discovery of the Shaldra Anu, the forgotten bond, was more than coincidence. The ancient text spoke of a power that once united humans and Galdorians, something that had been lost for eons. And it was clear that she, somehow, was the key to unlocking it. But what did it mean to take the trials of the forgotten? No one she asked in the city seemed to have even heard of them, not even the oldest scholars in the archives. The Galdorians had long abandoned their ancient ways, relying on their technological and telepathic advancements instead. Lyra realized she would have to seek the answers elsewhere, somewhere hidden, somewhere the Galdorians had forgotten existed. The ancient text had mentioned only one location, Zalkur, the Lost Forest. It was a forbidden place, far from the gleaming cities of Galdar Prime, where few dared to go. Legends whispered of its dangers, wild beasts, unstable terrain, and worse traps left behind by the ancients to guard their secrets. No one had ventured there in centuries. But Lyra knew that if the trials still existed, they would be hidden there. Determined, she gathered her few belongings, a cloak, some food, and a small knife she had kept hidden under her bed, and left the city under the cover of night. The sprawling metropolis of crystalline towers faded into the distance as she traveled, and soon she was alone, with only the stars above her to guide the way. The journey to Zalkur was long and treacherous. For days, Lyra trekked through barren deserts and dense forests, the whispers of her ancestors her only company. They spoke to her in moments of exhaustion, offering fragments of encouragement, or sometimes, cryptic warnings. The further she ventured from the city, the more the pull in her chest intensified, guiding her towards something she couldn't yet comprehend. When she finally reached the outskirts of Zalkur, the forest loomed before her like a living shadow. The trees were massive, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their roots rising up from the ground like the bones of some long-dead creature. The air was thick with mist, and an eerie silence filled the space, broken only by the occasional rustle of unseen creatures moving in the darkness. Lyra hesitated at the forest's edge, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel it, the weight of the unknown pressing down on her, the fear that maybe this journey was a mistake. But then, the voice returned, strong and steady. "You have come this far, Lyra. You must enter. The trials await you." Swallowing her fear, Lyra stepped into the forest. The forest seemed to twist and bend around her as she ventured deeper into its depths. The path ahead was not always clear, and more than once, Lyra found herself disoriented, unsure of which way to go. But the whispers guided her, and she pressed on, determined to find the trials. As the trees closed in around her, Lyra felt a strange sensation growing in the back of her mind. It was as if the forest itself was watching her, testing her. Shadows flickered in the corners of her vision, and at times, she swore she could hear voices that didn't belong to her ancestors, but to something else. Something older. After what felt like hours, she emerged into a small clearing. At its center stood an ancient stone archway, half buried in the earth and covered in vines. The air around it seemed to hum with energy, and Lyra knew she had found the entrance to the trials of the forgotten. Taking a deep breath, she stepped through the archway. The second trial, the test of knowledge, was different. This time, Lyra found herself in a chamber filled with strange, glowing symbols carved into the walls. The symbols pulsed with an otherworldly energy, and Lyra could sense that they were part of the ancient Galdorian telepathic network, the same one she had only just begun to touch. The challenge was clear: she had to connect with the network in a way she never had before. But how? Lyra sat in the center of the chamber, closing her eyes and reaching out with her mind. The telepathic current was there, just beyond her grasp, but this time, she didn't force it. Instead, she let herself be guided by the whispers, by the ancient voice that had led her here. Slowly, the symbols began to glow brighter, and Lyra felt the current flow through her, not just as a distant hum, but as a river of thought and energy. She could sense the minds of those who had come before her Galdorian ancestors, human explorers, and something else, something older still. The knowledge flowed into her, revealing fragments of forgotten history, secrets of both Galdorian and human origins, and the truth of the Shaldra anew. She understood now. The bond between humans and Galdorians had been more than just a connection of minds, it had been a union of strengths, emotions, and spirit. And that bond had once been the source of incredible power. As the knowledge flooded her mind, the symbols on the walls dimmed, and the trial ended. Lyra had passed the second test. The final trial was the most difficult. It was called the Test of Unity, and as soon as Lyra entered the chamber, she understood why. The chamber was vast, its walls lined with mirrors. In each mirror, Lyra saw a different reflection of herself, one as a human, with her brown hair and fragile form, another as a Galdorian, tall and powerful, with the silver eyes of her ancestors. Each reflection was a different version of her, but none of them felt whole. The voice returned, softer now, but filled with purpose. You must merge them, Lyra. To succeed, you must become both. Lyra stood before the mirrors, her heart pounding. She had always felt torn between her two identities, human and Galdorian, weak and strong. But now, she understood that the true power came not from choosing one or the other, but from embracing both. She reached out toward the mirrors, and as she did, the reflections began to blur. Her human form merged with her Galdorian one, and she felt a surge of energy unlike anything she had ever known. Her mind expanded, her senses heightened, and for the first time in her life, she felt complete. The chamber dissolved around her, and Lyra stood alone in the center of the forest, the trials behind her. She had succeeded. She had awakened the ancestral strength within her. When Lyra returned to the edge of Zalkur, she was no longer the same girl who had entered. The power of both her human and Galdorian ancestors flowed through her now, balanced and whole. She could feel the telepathic current like a living pulse, and her emotions, once a source of shame, had become the key to her strength. She was no longer an outcast. She was the bridge between two worlds, the heir to the forgotten bond. And with this newfound power, she knew that the future of both humans and Galdorians would be changed forever. But her journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Lyra emerged from the depths of Zalkur a changed being. The weight of the trials had settled within her, not as a burden but as a new understanding of who she truly was. The ancient power of the Shaldra anew flowed through her veins, a fusion of human resilience and Galdorian telepathy. She could feel it now, a hum of energy, both mental and physical, that connected her to the long-forgotten lineage of both worlds. The path back to Galdar Prime was long, but Lyra's mind was clearer than ever. She no longer felt the pain of isolation that had haunted her every step before. Now, with each stride, she felt a pull toward something larger, a destiny that awaited her. The whispers of her ancestors had quieted, but their presence lingered, a constant reminder that she was no longer alone. As she approached the outskirts of the city, she could sense the telepathic web of the Galdorians reaching out toward her. It was a strange sensation, one she had always been outside of, but now, she could feel their thoughts and emotions brushing against hers. It wasn't full telepathy, not the way the Galdorians used it, but a more complex, deeper connection. She could sense their fear, their uncertainty, and their pride. It was all laid bare to her now. When she crossed into the city, Lyra was no longer unnoticed. Galdorians stared as she passed, their eyes wide with surprise and curiosity. They could feel the change in her, even if they didn't understand it. She stood taller now, her brown hair, once a symbol of her alien heritage, seemed to shimmer with a new vitality. And her eyes, no longer just human now, gleamed with a silver tint, a mark of the Galdorian ancestry she had embraced. It didn't take long for the news of her return to reach the council. The Galdorian council chambers were as imposing as ever, towering pillars of gleaming crystal that radiated light in every direction. Lyra had only been inside once before, as a child, when her mother had been stripped of her status and exiled. The memory of that day still stung, but now, as she stood in the center of the great hall, she felt no fear. The council members were already gathered, their eyes locked on her as she entered. At their head stood Counselor Aerith, a tall, regal figure with cold, calculating eyes. He had always been the most vocal opponent of Lyra's existence, viewing her very presence as a stain on the purity of the Galdorian race. Beside him were other high-ranking officials, their expressions a mix of suspicion and curiosity. "Lyra Reyes," Counselor Aerith said, his voice echoing through the chamber. "You've returned from Zalkur." He spoke the name of the Forbidden Forest with a hint of disbelief, as if he couldn't quite comprehend that she had survived the journey. "What is it that you seek?" Lyra met his gaze, unflinching. She had expected their doubt, their fear of what she had become. But she wasn't here to seek approval. She was here to claim her place. "I seek nothing from you," Lyra said, her voice steady and calm. "I have come to tell you that the power you believe in, your telepathy, your control over the current, is not the only path. There is a bond older than your empire, a strength that you have long forgotten." The council members exchanged uneasy glances. Counselor Aerith's face tightened, his sharp features twisting into a scowl. "You speak of the Shaldra Anu," he said, his tone dismissive. "A myth, long buried in the past. You claim to have found it, but what proof do you bring? What can a half-human child possibly understand about ancient Galdorian power?" Lyra felt the stirrings of anger rise within her, but she didn't let it control her. Instead, she closed her eyes, drawing on the strength she had gained from the trials. She reached inward, toward the place where her human and Galdorian selves had merged, and allowed the energy to flow through her. When she opened her eyes again, they were glowing with a soft silver light. The room fell silent. Without a word, Lyra extended her mind toward the council members. She felt their defenses rise, their mental barriers snapping into place. They were trying to block her, to keep her out. But the Shaldra Anu was not like Galdorian telepathy. It was not about domination or control. It was about connection. She reached deeper, allowing the emotions of the council members to wash over her, their doubts, their fears, their pride. And then, slowly, she shared with them the truth she had uncovered in the trials, the unity of both human and Galdorian strengths. She showed them the ancient memories that had been passed down through the bond, the time when the two races had stood as equals, complementing each other's weaknesses and amplifying each other's strengths. She felt their resistance waver, their minds struggling to comprehend what she was showing them. Aerith, especially, fought back, his telepathic walls slamming into place. But even he couldn't fully block her out. "This is impossible," Aerith hissed, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You are a child of impurity. You cannot dash." "I am both," Lyra interrupted, her voice echoing through the chamber with unexpected power. "Human and Galdorian. And it is in that union that I have found strength." The council members stared at her, their disbelief slowly giving way to awe. They could feel it, this new energy that flowed through her, this ancient power that had once united their ancestors. It was undeniable now, even to them. "You have spent centuries denying your emotions, suppressing what makes you truly powerful," Lyra continued, her voice softening but no less commanding. "The Galdorian telepathy you rely on is only part of what you could be. Emotions, love, empathy, resilience, these are not weaknesses. They are strengths. And I am proof of that." Silence fell over the chamber once more, heavier this time. Counselor Aerith's face was pale, his hands clenched at his sides. But he couldn't refute what he had just experienced. Finally, one of the older council members, a woman named Saran, spoke. Her voice was quiet, contemplative. "The Shaldra Anu was believed lost," she said, her eyes fixed on Lyra. "But if what you say is true, then you may hold the key to our future. A future where both our people, Galdorian and human, can thrive together once again." Lyra nodded. "That is what I believe. But it will not be easy. Your pride has blinded you for too long. Rebuilding the bond will take time, and it will require change. But I know it's possible. The chamber buzzed with uncertainty, but there was a shift, a crack in the rigid structure that had governed Galdorian society for so long. They could no longer deny what Lyra had shown them. The power of the Shaldra Anu was real, and it lived within her. Counselor Aerith, though still visibly shaken, straightened, his voice cold but resigned. "What do you propose, Lyra Reyes?" Lyra took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her next words. She had come this far, and now the path forward was clear. "I propose unity," she said. "A new path, where humans and Galdorians work together, as they once did. We have much to learn from each other, and together, we can unlock a strength far greater than what we've known. But it requires all of you to let go of your superiority and open yourselves to something new." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, it seemed as though the entire chamber held its breath. Then, slowly, Counselor Saran nodded. "You are right. We must change if we are to survive." The others murmured in agreement, though some still looked uncertain, and Aerith's expression remained hard. But Lyra could see it now, a crack in the wall, a beginning. She had done what she had set out to do. She had proven that her difference was not a weakness, but a strength. She was no longer the little earthling, the half-breed outcast. She was the heir to the Shaldra Anu, the bridge between two worlds. As Lyra left the council chambers, the whispers of her ancestors quieted, their voices fading into the background. She no longer needed them to guide her. Her path was her own now. And it was only the beginning.